Hello, everyone. This is Colonel Gallagher. This is from my students in the Gallagherized tube. And I've had some requests. And the next installment, we had the Constitution signed. And now this new nation, the United States, is born into the world under this Constitution. And all the problems are solved. No. They had just begun. And really, to think about this next segment, we're talking about the first president, George Washington. And there's so much to discuss. And I don't have any books with me, but I will make some recommendations if you wish, and I'll show you some next time. What I want to try to get across when you look at Washington's presidency, the first presidency, is that the Americans had never had a president. That's the first thing to understand. What the world had seen, what the Americans had been very used to, was a king. They were subjects. And what George Washington did, one of his first things is he traveled the United States. Now, as he traveled, he tried to get to know the people and tried to get a sense of the country. And what he found was a couple things. The first thing is that when people talked about their country, they meant their state. And so everyone was still very state minded. So it goes back to, okay, you got this Constitution, and we take it for granted that all of a sudden everybody, became this unified body that loved on one another. And that's absolutely false. The second thing that Washington found as he traveled, sometimes Washington learned that there's tremendous sectionalism. The second thing Washington kind of learned as he traveled around, nobody knew what the heck a president was, so they greeted him in various ways. But he found out equally they didn't really like his carriage. It was very pompous, arrogant. It spoke and seemed to exude a sense of regal nature, royalty. This wasn't good. In fact, the favorite thing to me was where John Adams tried to make up a name of what should you call the president? What should Congress address him as? And he had this lengthy title which started out with His Highness, basically the president who protects our liberties and so on. He had this long address to be the president. Thank God for James Madison because he said no, that's not going to work. So James Madison, we shortened down. Now we call him Mr. President. Isn't that nice? I don't know. We can argue that for a while. There'd be some good running jokes in here, wouldn't there? Anyway, with this context, I want you to think of one year, 1789, and the Constitution is now accepted, except you got Rhode Island still hanging out there in North Carolina, right? I want you to think of the terms globally and locally. And what I mean by that is the only way to really look at the Washington administration and understand it is that the Washington administration, as the new nations formulating here and developing, globally, the Americans were dealing with three problems. Okay, and the last one's going to seem like it's not global, but it was. The first one's the French Revolution. When you think 1789 to any historian, they're going to say, "Oh, the French Revolution," and they're correct, the French Revolution. But the French Revolution was causing us problems. It was dividing the Americans politically. Never had a group of people entered so energetically and so willingly into a thing called a democratic tradition. That's what was born. And there's this tug of war that went on over the Constitution and where the power really resided. We always say the people, which people, and that's going to really be determined at the state level. And what you're going to see because of the French Revolution, it divided the Americans for really a couple things. If you know anything about the French Revolution, which way would it go? For some, like Hamilton, it was a shocking, horrifying experience because you had this period end up becoming the Reign of Terror, where heads were being lopped off and so on like this. A bunch of Jacobins, as he called it, got in control. And this was the rabble. This was the masses, and it was totally uncontrollable. Then you had people like Jefferson who initially said this is a wonderful thing, the French Revolution. This is the American Revolution on display, and the French are going to join us and formulate this wonderful republic. This is the new world order, so to speak. So the French Revolution divided the Americans politically, whether you supported it or not. Now the thing to look up is called the Edmund Genet affair, Genet. It's totally it's okay to look it up. It's a PG thing. It's not what you think with a French person involved, maybe. But the idea is the Genet affair had to do with this gentleman who came over to recruit Americans to go get involved in the French Revolution, and Washington said, no, okay, need to leave. It was already problematic enough. The second global event besides the French Revolution, showing these political divides and the support for the French Revolution, whether up for it or against it, had to do with the British and their forts. Even though the peace treaty was signed in 1783 with the British retained forts in the West, as you'd call it. This would be up in the areas where Michigan's at today, predominantly. And the British just didn't leave those forts. They were supposed to, accordingly, but they didn't. Now, these are all going to be, of course, the War of 1812 is coming out of this. If you it's the 1789, so the War of 1812 is a product of these events. And the third one, I told you globally, though, Native Americans. Now, Native Americans are not happy about the outcome of the American Revolution and this new unified bunch, and so they're a little nervous. They did sign a treaty called the Treaty of Greenville, which they ceded a tremendous amount of land, but there's going to be this hero that emerged among the Native Americans and try to form a unified Native American confederacy to stop westward expansion into these regions of the Ohio Valley. And his name would be Tecumseh. Very popular fellow, incredible person to read about. And this is linked to a global problem because this is where the British forts and the Native Americans go together. And this is the formulation, all of it, the French and Revolution, the Brits and the forts, and the idea of the British and the French eventually fighting in the Napoleonic Wars, and the Native Americans are all tied together. And this had to do with the War of 1812. The War of 1812 is as much as settling the issues of the West, when you look at these people called the Warhawks, as it was anything else. And so you have to kind of keep your eyes on those three things. But Washington's trying to deal with this, and he's trying to herd these cats, and he's finding it really problematic, and he's finding it really uncomfortable. Okay, so where does this mean locally? Two things. First is the revolution once again brought more people quickly into a direct uh, method of government. They're now involved. People go out and they vote, for heaven's sakes. The states determine the qualifications as far as property ownership, right? The states determine it. A lot of states start to loosen this. And you have more people that are absolutely excited to have this ability to vote and have their say. And what it's going to create, especially in the Western group, this is the second point of the local, is new groups are being formed. Okay, in these new groups, you get the rise of these called democratic societies. And these democratic societies are looking very cautiously at this new power of the federal government. And the number one way to see how this is dealt with, the number one event is the whiskey rebellion. I gotta say was, I'm sorry, was the whiskey rebellion. So Alexander Hamilton, as the first Secretary of the Treasury, has the capability to, make the government viable in revenue, raise money. So Hamilton conjured up three plans. Now, Hamlin's plan is very simple. First of all, he's going to he wants the state debts funded, which meant you're gonna have to have some way to raise some money in order to begin to pay these debts, and that's going to be a tax on whiskey. It's really a tax on grain. Let's be clear, and grain was used to make whiskey. And so what happened is he's taxing, the grain. When he's doing this, he's taxing the farmer. Now think on this a little bit. If you start thinking, this seems familiar. It's a product that is used widely, that is taxed heavily, and it's taxed on a farmer, which is really an average citizen. Stamp tax comes to mind if you think about this. And what you're going to see is a resistance to this. It's a complete resistance, especially in Western Pennsylvania. And the counties of Western Pennsylvania, these people are irate. They said, we're not going to do it. They just absolutely are what you call non-compliant. Now, here we are today. We're talking about wear a mask, wear a mask. This is an example of non-compliance. I'm not going to do it. Okay, and you can't make me. And the whiskey tax goes back to the Americans in the West operate and reacted the same way they always did. They protest. Can you imagine protest? They protest. They burn people in effigy that was members of the government. These agents are sent out. This is 1791, 92 that this is going on. They send these agents out to go collect the tax to make these people heal, and they beat them up. They beat them back. It reminds me when I read it of Boston all over again, and these poor tax collectors and the British had just said, look, we're just trying to collect this tax. And so what happens is nothing's changed. And as they resisted, Washington and his administration is forced to make a decision. What do you do? And finally, Washington, along with Hamilton's goading, is going to finally make a decision. They're going to decide by the time you get to 1794, this is 2 years later, they've had enough. And they're going to go ahead and make an example of this. And so Washington assembled a force of 13,000 troops. 13,000. The reason that's amazing is that's the exact number, basically around that number, that the Americans used to fight the British at the end of the American Revolution. This is insane to go get a bunch of farmers out there. And this is a show of force and power. a reckoning. And Hamilton and a few others, I'm not going to try to name all the names, but Hamilton and some of these other gentlemen, they're deep Federalists, like Edmund Randolph, are arguing this is a great day. We're going to strike a blow against these rabble, these folks out there that represent these democratic societies are just causing problems. Okay, and that are worried and worried about this centralized government. Sounds familiar. Sounds like England all over again. The American Revolution hasn't stopped, has it? And so what happened here is it's not very violent, not very bloody. There was a gentleman who was taken into custody. His name is Herman Husband, and he's a funny guy to read about because he's about 70 years old, if I remember correctly. He's given a trial. He's thrown into jail. He sits there. Finally, he's let go. This is in jail, Philadelphia. But he's so old, so frail. He dies on the way back, if I remember correctly, going all the way back to his home in Western Pennsylvania. And he's the real first major casualty of this. But Husband was this person that represented the enemy, and that to me is interesting when you think of this of how we demonize. And when you consider this, what the farmers were really doing was trying to protest in a sense. Okay, so this sent the message of how much power should the central government use. This is a grand question. So Hamilton said, let's tax the grain, which Jefferson and Madison are absolutely up in arms about. You're taxing the farmer. But the other one that drove them nuts the most is Hamilton then said, okay, we need to retire this debt that we've had, which really means pay those that had these tickets of a promise of payment back to their service, which related to the soldiers. Now these tickets have been sold, and a lot of people who held these tickets were men of wealth. They had bought these tickets up. This is an investment to them. And Madison knew this, and he knew that these guys had these tickets, and it was no longer in the original person's hand anymore. And he said, this is absurd that you're going to pay this to these people who no longer should go to the original owners of these tickets. Well, guess what? If you really do your research, you're going to find out that some of these people who had these tickets were members of Congress. Isn't this awesome? And isn't this convenient? And so what you get out of this is it passes. Madison's irate, and he says, this is so wrong. And so in doing so, there's this objection to what Hamilton's doing. And in Madison's mind and Jefferson's, Hamilton is reconstructing an English model. He's shifting this power towards an elite. And this is this Federalist Party. These democratic societies now begin to take up, okay, the opposition to the Federalist Party. And you now have the birth of these two political parties. They're born right there in these local formations, never intended, but they're created out of this argument about who holds the real power and how much should the federal government have as far as power goes. The last thing is Alexander Hamilton says, well, we're going to create a bank. Now who's going to invest in this bank? Well, it's going to be the wealthy. It's going to be a system of privilege, is the argument Madison made. And so this becomes this dynamic of who. Think about it. Madison and Hamilton were the two big authors of the Federalist Papers, arguing for the need for a constitution and a stronger government. They're at odds with each other because now as you see the machinations, the workings of the government, not the parchment, not theory, but the working of it, there's an issue. And so this is always the way it is. We could all sit at the Declaration of Independence. We could all look at this and quote from it. We could look at the Constitution and agree. But the machinations, the working of it is really what we come down to. And at heart, we're all Federalists and anti-Federalists. At heart, we're all Democrats and Republicans. At heart, we're all Federalists or Democratic-Republicans is what I meant to say. And so when you look at this, the Federalists then are these pro-British folks, reject the ideas of this French Revolution, which is going crazy and just inciting rebellion across the globe, I guess. They're aristocratic by that design. They believe the power should be in a certain group's hands. They don't understand how the masses really rule. So there's this sense of reining in, this moderation, this conservative view. And then finally, they're a loose constructionist. Because look at the Constitution. Where does it say that Congress can create a bank? It doesn't. That's why the necessary proper clause. It's very elastic. You can go ahead and say, well, Hamilton, in other words, loose construction. Where in the Constitution does it say we can't create the bank? Jefferson took the opposite view. Jefferson is Democratic Republicans, pro-French, okay? They're democratic by design. The power really should be vested in the people. The government that governs least governs best. They keep it local. And then limit the authority of the central government. And then the last things are strict constructionists. I mean, when you read the Constitution, whatever it says, that's it. You can't do any more. Okay, there's a limitation. And so you begin to see these two formulate. Okay, now be careful of trying to say we're like this group or like that group, because there's going to be a tremendous change and shifts. It's very difficult, I think, personally, but also historically anyway. Okay, so which path would the nation follow is where we're at. I've taken on quite a bit, and I'm sorry for that. But the idea when you summarize this, with Madison and Hamilton, Jefferson, Washington in the middle of this. And Washington is not having a good time with his presidency. The press, that Democratic Republican group, those democratic societies, are writing, they're publishing the newspapers tremendously horrible things about Washington. He's a tyrant to them. He's like another George, literally another King George, you know. And they don't like this. They don't like the way he suppressed the farmers in the West, and the Whiskey Rebellion gets around. The democratic societies are not just those in the country. You have them in New York City. Hamilton makes note of this, where he goes and he tries to reason, I guess is the word used, with some of these folks, and he ends up getting hit in the head with a rock. And then, which is a great joke, because Jefferson said, well, I guess if anything, they could have knocked all the brains of the Federalists out in one throw. Even though Hamilton's really the only guy in the Federalist who really has any brains of the operation, is what Jefferson's saying. But Hamilton almost gets in a duel with a gentleman in New York City. That's averted later on. They didn't do it. It's heated. It's passionate. Here we are. And this is exactly the way we are. And we should be. We're heated, we're passionate, but we should be reasonable. And that's the difference. That's what worries me with what you see. Being heated and passionate is wonderful. There's a great quote, and it's by a very strange person, I guess, meaning it's not Ben Franklin, it's not Washington, it's not Madison. The quote goes this way: voting is completely important. People in America think democracy is a given. It is rather an ecosystem. And what gets in the way of it is politicians. And here's apathy. That's Henry Rollins. It's a good quote. And when you think about it, apathy. The right to vote is a right that many have sacrificed for. Washington, first in war, first in peace, first in his countrymen's heart. You can't take away what he did. Nonetheless, when you look at this, there is a sense that the energy and the passion has always been the hope of the people. As Madison said during this raucous time, when Congress is considering censoring, meaning not allowing these democratic societies to continue to print, and not allowing these democratic societies to continue to voice their opinion, Madison said it should never be the government that censors the people, but rather the people that censor the government. It is an important design, regardless of what your political affiliation is. It's poppycock to bring that into the sense of it. It clouds. It airs the judgment. And I think that's what the times call for, is reasoning based on certain guidelines and principles that we can sit and say, this is true. These are self-evident truths. And so what we're going to look at next time, I'll move you towards, is the Adams administration, the idea of what's called the Alien and Sedition Acts. We're going right back to what can the government do and what can the government not do. And the Alien and Sedition Acts in 1798, it was the ultimate example of really the dispute of power. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Who determines the constitutionality of a law? And so with that, I know I went a little longer. I apologize again, but these are passionate and unique times. I hope that this is helping some of you. I hope that you're trying to understand some of this. If not, let me know. I'll be happy to try to, come across better. Also, I'm very tired at this time of the night, so maybe I'm kind of rambling on. Anyway, be passionate, be energetic, but be reasonable. Okay, thank you. Bye-bye.